The sun had already set when the assistant district attorney finished reviewing his case files. After 15 years working as a federal prosecutor, late nights were nothing new to him. His colleagues often joked that he practically lived at the office, but his dedication had earned him widespread respect. Judges appreciated his thorough preparation, defense attorneys respected his fairness, and his fellow prosecutors looked up to him as a mentor. That evening, he packed his briefcase with tomorrow's court documents and headed to the parking garage. The city streets were quieter now, with only the occasional car passing by. He turned on the radio to keep himself company during the drive home. A jazz tune filled the car as he stopped at a red light, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. When the blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror about 10 minutes from his house, he wasn't particularly concerned. He checked his speedometer. He hadn't been speeding. Perhaps a taillight was out. He signaled and pulled over to the curb, then reached for his wallet to get his license ready. 2 officers approached his car, one on each side. The prosecutor rolled down his window and offered a polite greeting. License and registration, the officer on the driver's side demanded, not bothering with a hello. His nameplate read, Officer Wilson. The second officer stood watching with his hand resting near his holster, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the nighttime hour. The prosecutor handed over his documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I don't believe I was speeding." Officer Wilson shined his flashlight directly into the prosecutor's eyes, making him squint and turn away. "Where are you coming from at this hour?" "I was working late at the federal courthouse. I'm an assistant district attorney." He reached slowly toward his jacket pocket. "I have my credentials if you'd like to see them." "Keep your hands where I can see them," snapped the second officer, stepping closer to the window. The prosecutor froze, then carefully placed both hands on the steering wheel. "My federal ID is in my inside jacket pocket." "I'm just trying to show you my credentials." Officer Wilson scoffed. "Yeah, right, federal prosecutor. And I'm the Chief Justice." He exchanged a look with his partner that made the prosecutor's stomach tighten. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Wilson said, his tone shifting from dismissive to commanding. "May I ask why?" "I've provided my license and registration." The second officer leaned down to the window. "Because we said so. Or do federal prosecutors think they're above following instructions from police?" Something in the way he emphasized federal prosecutors, with a particular tone that carried unmistakable contempt, made it clear this was no longer about a traffic violation if it ever had been. The prosecutor took a deep breath. With deliberate movements, he reached for his phone in the cup holder, pressing the record button on his voice memo app before setting it back down. Years of working with law enforcement had taught him that most officers were honorable people doing a difficult job. But it had also taught him that documentation could be a lifesaver when encountering the rare exceptions. "I'm happy to comply, officers," he said calmly, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I just want to understand the reason for this stop." As he unbuckled his seatbelt, he caught Officer Wilson muttering something to his partner. The words were quiet, but in the stillness of the night, they carried clearly enough for the prosecutor to hear. Words so inappropriate and biased that they confirmed his worst suspicions about what was really happening. This traffic stop was about to become something much more significant than either officer could possibly imagine. The prosecutor stepped out of his car slowly, following the officer's instructions. The night air felt cold against his face as he stood on the roadside, cars occasionally driving past with curious glances at the scene. "Stand against the vehicle, hands on the hood," Officer Wilson ordered, his voice unnecessarily loud in the quiet neighborhood. The prosecutor complied without argument. He'd seen too many situations escalate when people resisted, even when they had every right to question what was happening. As a lawyer, he knew his rights, but he also knew that this wasn't the time to assert them. That would come later. What these officers didn't know was that his phone was still recording everything from the cup holder inside his car. He had started this habit about 2 years ago after listening to countless community members describe troubling encounters during neighborhood outreach meetings. "If only I had proof," they would say, their stories dismissed without evidence. The prosecutor had taken those words to heart. Officer Wilson stood uncomfortably close while his partner began searching through the car without permission or probable cause. "You finding anything?" Wilson called out. "Nothing yet," came the reply as the other officer rummaged through the glove compartment, tossing insurance papers and vehicle registration onto the passenger seat. "So you work at the federal courthouse, huh?" Wilson asked, his tone making it clear he didn't believe it. "Big important lawyer? That's what you're claiming?" "Yes, sir. I've been a federal prosecutor for 15 years, the prosecutor answered calmly, still facing the car with his hands on the hood. 15 years? Wilson laughed. "And I suppose you handle all the major cases too, right?" The prosecutor stayed silent, recognizing the trap. Anything he said now would be twisted into sounding boastful or confrontational. Inside the car, the phone continued recording as the second officer moved to the back seat, opening the prosecutor's briefcase without warrant or consent. "Hey, look at this," he called to Wilson. "Got a bunch of fancy-looking legal papers. Maybe he wasn't lying about being a lawyer." Then, in a lower voice that he thought wouldn't carry, "Still doesn't mean he belongs in this neighborhood." The prosecutor's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. The comment confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning about the true nature of this stop. "What's in the briefcase?" Wilson asked, still standing behind the prosecutor. "Court documents for tomorrow's hearing. Confidential case files." "Well, we need to check everything thoroughly," Wilson replied. "Can't be too careful these days." The officers continued their search for nearly 20 minutes, finding nothing but legal papers and ordinary items. All the while, their conversation grew more relaxed as they apparently forgot the prosecutor could hear them. Their comments became increasingly unprofessional, remarks about his clothes being too fancy, speculation about how he could afford his car, and occasional comments about his kind, thinking they're above the law. The prosecutor remained silent, mentally cataloging each inappropriate statement, each violation of protocol. His phone captured it all: the illegal search, the comments tinged with prejudice, and most importantly, the moment when Wilson's partner returned to the front of the car. "His ID checks out," the partner said quietly, sounding disappointed. "He really is a federal prosecutor." Wilson sighed loudly. "Well, isn't that something? Still doesn't explain what he's doing driving around here this time of night." "Going home," the prosecutor said simply. "I live 10 minutes from here." The officers exchanged a look that spoke volumes, surprise mixed with something like annoyance. The prosecutor knew that look. He'd seen it countless times in his career. The look of someone whose assumptions had been challenged, but who wasn't ready to admit they were wrong. What they didn't realize was that those 20 minutes of recording would soon change everything. For them, for the prosecutor, and potentially for the entire department. "Get in the back of the patrol car while we finish checking your information," Officer Wilson commanded, pointing to the police vehicle parked behind the prosecutor's sedan. "Is that really necessary? You've verified my ID and searched my car," the prosecutor said, trying to keep his voice level despite his growing frustration. "It's necessary because I said it's necessary," Wilson snapped. "Or would you prefer we add resisting an officer to the situation?" The prosecutor took a deep breath. He knew this tactic well from his years in the courtroom, the implied threat designed to force compliance. With deliberate calm, he walked to the patrol car and slid into the back seat. The door closed with a heavy thud, and he noticed there were no interior handles. He was now effectively detained without cause. Through the partition, he could see the officers standing beside his car, talking. Their voices came through faintly. "What do you think? Should we bring him in?" the second officer asked. "For what?" Wilson responded. "We don't have anything solid. We could say we smelled something in the vehicle." The prosecutor's heart raced. He knew exactly what they were considering, manufacturing probable cause after the fact. It was the kind of police misconduct that could ruin innocent lives and that he had prosecuted officers for in the past. Wilson seemed to consider it before shaking his head. "Nah, not worth the paperwork. Plus, he's a Fed. Might cause more trouble than it's worth." For 45 long minutes, the prosecutor sat in the back of that patrol car, watching as the officers continued to search his vehicle without legal justification. They were clearly taking their time, stretching out his detention to make a point. Occasionally, they would glance at him with expressions that made their message clear. They had the power here, badge or no badge. From his uncomfortable seat, the prosecutor noticed something concerning. The officers' body cameras, Equipment required by department policy to be activated during all civilian interactions were either turned off or missing entirely. This detail added to his growing catalogue of violations. The night grew colder as he waited. A few more cars passed by, slowing down to look at the scene. A well-dressed man in the back of a police car, 2 officers searching a high-end sedan. He wondered what stories they were creating in their minds. He wondered what story would have been created about him if he didn't have that recording. Finally, after what felt like hours, Officer Wilson opened the patrol car door. "Step out," he ordered. The prosecutor emerged from the backseat, stretching his stiff limbs. The night had turned from merely cool to genuinely cold. Well, Wilson said, holding up the prosecutor's credentials. "Looks like you weren't lying after all. Assistant District Attorney for the federal court." His tone suggested this was a disappointing discovery rather than an apology-worthy mistake. The second officer approached with a small notepad. "We're issuing you a citation for failure to signal a lane change." The prosecutor blinked in surprise. "That's not accurate. I didn't change lanes improperly." "Are you calling me a liar?" the officer challenged, stepping closer. "Because it's your word against ours, and guess whose report the judge is going to believe?" The prosecutor fell silent, accepting the citation without further argument. He knew the recording in his car would show the truth, that he had used his turn signal appropriately, that this ticket was fabricated as retribution for not being the person they expected when they pulled him over. "You should be more careful driving in this area," Wilson added as he handed back the prosecutor's license and registration. "It's not always safe for visitors, and you might not get such understanding officers next time." The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. "You're free to go," Wilson said finally, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But remember, we patrol this area every night. We'll be seeing you around." As the prosecutor returned to his car, his mind was already racing with decisions about what to do next. The recording in his cup holder had captured far more than a simple case of harassment. It had documented what appeared to be systemic abuse of power, the kind that required serious action. The prosecutor barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Officer Wilson's smug face and heard the threatening tone of his warning. By morning, he had listened to the recording 3 times, each replay making his stomach tighten with a mix of anger and resolve. Sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold, he considered his options. The easy path was clear: file the recording away, pay the bogus ticket, and move on with his life. After all, he had cases waiting, victims counting on him, and a career that required good relationships with law enforcement. He picked up his phone and scrolled to the contact of his old mentor, a retired judge who had guided him through the early years of his career. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. "This is unexpected," the retired judge said warmly. "You're usually buried in casework by this hour." "I need your advice," the prosecutor said, and then described the previous night's events in detail. "So you have all of this recorded?" his mentor asked when he finished. "Every word. Every illegal search. Every biased comment." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You understand what filing a complaint could mean? The blowback? The department closing ranks." The prosecutor stared out his kitchen window at the neighborhood he loved. "I do. Some officers you work with might see this as betrayal, even the good ones." "I know." His mentor's voice softened. "What's really bothering you about this, beyond the obvious violations?" The prosecutor thought for a moment. "If they did this to me, someone with a badge, legal training, and resources, what are they doing to people without those advantages? How many others have they pulled over who couldn't fight back?" "That's the question, isn't it?" His mentor agreed. "So what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about the oath I took. About the community meetings where people begged for someone to take their complaints seriously. About all the times I told them to trust the system." He picked up the citation, looking at the fabricated charge. In 15 years of prosecuting cases, he had built his reputation on following proper channels and respecting the difficult job that officers did. He had always believed that most officers were honorable people doing their best in challenging circumstances. "If I don't act on this," he continued, "how can I look those community members in the eye next time? How can I tell them the system works when I know firsthand that sometimes it doesn't?" There's another consideration, his mentor added. The timing. Your big corruption case goes to trial next month. Some might see this as a distraction or worse, a way to undermine your credibility. The prosecutor hadn't even thought of that angle. The corruption case against a former city official had already generated threats and pressure. Adding a police misconduct complaint would only intensify the spotlight. After hanging up, he sat for nearly an hour, weighing all sides of the issue. Professional consequences against personal integrity. Potential harm to working relationships against the harm of staying silent. The easy path against the right one. By the time he showered and dressed for work, his decision was made. Instead of his usual routine of reviewing case notes on his commute, he made 3 phone calls, one to his direct supervisor, one to the police commissioner's office, and one to the head of internal affairs. I need an emergency meeting this morning, he told each of them. It concerns officer misconduct from last night, and I have audio evidence. His supervisor sounded concerned. Are you sure about this? We need the department's cooperation on the corruption case. I'm sure, he replied, his voice steady with newfound resolve. Some things matter more than a single case, even an important one. He arrived at work earlier than usual, nodding to the security guard as he entered the building. His meeting was set for 9:00 a.m. in the commissioner's office, just 2 hours away. As he organized his notes and prepared the audio file, he felt a strange calm replace his earlier turmoil. Whatever happened next, he knew he was doing what he had always promised the community he would do: hold everyone accountable to the same standard of justice, regardless of their position or power. The police commissioner's office was impressive: wood-paneled walls lined with photos of him shaking hands with mayors and governors, awards and commendations displayed in glass cases. The prosecutor had been here before, but usually to discuss joint operations or high-profile cases, not to file a complaint against officers. He arrived 10 minutes early, nodding to the commissioner's assistant as he took a seat in the waiting area. The internal affairs chief arrived next, giving him a curious look but saying little. His own supervisor from the district attorney's office was the last to arrive, looking concerned. You want to give me a preview of what this is about? His supervisor asked quietly. Better if everyone hears it together, the prosecutor replied. The commissioner's door opened, and the man himself appeared. Tall, silver-haired, with the confident posture of someone used to command. Come in, everyone, he said, gesturing them into his office. I've cleared 30 minutes for this meeting, so let's make it count. They settled around a conference table in the corner of the large office. The commissioner leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. So, he began, what's this urgent matter involving my officers? The prosecutor placed his phone on the table. Last night I was pulled over by 2 officers from the 5th Precinct. What should have been a routine traffic stop turned into something very different. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Rather than describe it, I think it's better if you hear it. He pressed play, and the recording began. At first, the commissioner's face showed mild interest, perhaps expecting to hear a minor complaint blown out of proportion. But as the audio continued, capturing the officer's escalating hostility, the illegal search, the detention without cause, and most damning of all, the comments they made when they thought no one was listening, his expression transformed. By the time the recording reached the part where the officers discussed manufacturing a reason to bring the prosecutor in, the commissioner's face had turned a deep shade of red. When it captured the fabricated citation and the thinly veiled threats, he sat forward, all pretense of casual interest gone. As the recording ended, a heavy silence filled the room. The prosecutor looked around at the others. His supervisor was staring at the table, visibly disturbed. The internal affairs chief had stopped taking notes entirely, his pen frozen mid-word on his notepad. The commissioner was the first to speak. When did this happen? Last night, around 11:30 p.m. And you're certain these are my officers? The prosecutor nodded. Officer Wilson's nameplate is clearly visible in my dashcam footage, which I've also preserved. The other officer was never directly identified, but Wilson referred to him as his partner. The commissioner's jaw tightened. You have video too? Yes. The dashcam activates automatically when the car is running. It doesn't capture audio inside the vehicle, but it shows the entire stop from beginning to end. The internal affairs chief finally found his voice. Why bring this directly to the commissioner? There are procedures for filing complaints. The prosecutor met his gaze steadily. Because this isn't just about one traffic stop. The officer's behavior suggests a pattern, not an isolated incident. They were too comfortable, too practiced. He turned back to the commissioner. Also, I should mention that I've already sent copies of both recordings to my contact at the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. And I submitted the audio file to my own files at the U.S. Attorney's Office for safekeeping. The commissioner's eyes widened slightly at this information. The message was clear. This wasn't going to disappear, regardless of what happened in this room. What do you want? The commissioner asked, his tone now serious and businesslike. I want accountability. Not just for these officers, but systemic accountability. New training protocols, revised disciplinary procedures, independent review of similar complaints. The prosecutor leaned forward. And I want to meet these officers face to face. The commissioner considered this for a long moment before reaching for his phone. Get me Officers Wilson and his partner from last night's shift. Tell them to report to my office immediately. He glanced at his watch. And clear my calendar for the next hour. As the commissioner hung up, he fixed the prosecutor with an evaluating look. They'll be here in about 10 minutes. They have no idea what's waiting for them. The prosecutor nodded, feeling a curious mix of dread and determination. The next few minutes would change careers, possibly lives. But more importantly, they might be the first step toward changing a system that had protected the wrong people for too long. The police commissioner's office was impressive. Wood-paneled walls lined with photos of him shaking hands with mayors and governors, awards and commendations displayed in glass cases. The prosecutor had been here before, but usually to discuss joint operations or high-profile cases, not to file a complaint against officers. He arrived 10 minutes early, nodding to the commissioner's assistant as he took a seat in the waiting area. The Internal Affairs chief arrived next, giving him a curious look but saying little. His own supervisor from the district attorney's office was the last to arrive, looking concerned. You want to give me a preview of what this is about? His supervisor asked quietly. Better if everyone hears it together, the prosecutor replied. The commissioner's door opened, and the man himself appeared. Tall, silver-haired, with the confident posture of someone used to command. Come in, everyone, he said, gesturing them into his office. I've cleared 30 minutes for this meeting, so let's make it count. They settled around a conference table in the corner of the large office. The commissioner leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. So, he began, what's this urgent matter involving my officers? The prosecutor placed his phone on the table. Last night I was pulled over by 2 officers from the 5th Precinct. What should have been a routine traffic stop turned into something very different. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Rather than describe it, I think it's better if you hear it. He pressed play, and the recording began. At first, the commissioner's face showed mild interest, perhaps expecting to hear a minor complaint blown out of proportion. But as the audio continued, capturing the officer's escalating hostility, the illegal search, the detention without cause, and most damning of all, the comments they made when they thought no one was listening, his expression transformed. By the time the recording reached the part where the officers discussed manufacturing a reason to bring the prosecutor in, the commissioner's face had turned a deep shade of red. When it captured the fabricated citation and the thinly veiled threats, he sat forward, all pretense of casual interest gone. As the recording ended, a heavy silence filled the room. The prosecutor looked around at the others. His supervisor was staring at the table, visibly disturbed. The Internal Affairs chief had stopped taking notes entirely, his pen frozen mid-word on his notepad. The commissioner was the first to speak. When did this happen? Last night, around 11:30 p.m. And you're certain these are my officers? The prosecutor nodded. Officer Wilson's nameplate is clearly visible in my dashcam footage, which I've also preserved. The other officer was never directly identified, but Wilson referred to him as his partner. The commissioner's jaw tightened. You have video too? Yes. The dashcam activates automatically when the car is running. It doesn't capture audio inside the vehicle, but it shows the entire stop from beginning to end. The Internal Affairs chief finally found his voice. Why bring this directly to the commissioner? There are procedures for filing complaints. The prosecutor met his gaze steadily. Because this isn't just about one traffic stop. The officer's behavior suggests a pattern, not an isolated incident. They were too comfortable, too practiced. He turned back to the commissioner. Also, I should mention that I've already sent copies of both recordings to my contact at the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, and I submitted the audio file to my own files at the U.S. Attorney's Office for safekeeping. The commissioner's eyes widened slightly at this information. The message was clear. This wasn't going to disappear, regardless of what happened in this room. "What do you want?" the commissioner asked, his tone now serious and businesslike. "I want accountability. Not just for these officers, but systemic accountability. New training protocols, revised disciplinary procedures, independent review of similar complaints." The prosecutor leaned forward. "And I want to meet these officers face to face." The commissioner considered this for a long moment before reaching for his phone. "Get me Officers Wilson and his partner from last night's shift. Tell them to report to my office immediately." He glanced at his watch. "And clear my calendar for the next hour." As the commissioner hung up, he fixed the prosecutor with an evaluating look. "They'll be here in about 10 minutes. They have no idea what's waiting for them." The prosecutor nodded, feeling a curious mix of dread and determination. The next few minutes would change careers, possibly lives. But more importantly, they might be the first step toward changing a system that had protected the wrong people for too long. The wait seemed endless. The prosecutor sipped water from a glass the commissioner's assistant had brought in, trying to calm his racing heart. This wasn't like preparing for court. This was personal in a way his cases rarely were. A knock on the door broke the tense silence. "Come in," called the commissioner. The door swung open, and there they were, the two officers from last night. Officer Wilson came first, walking with the confident stride of someone who'd never faced serious consequences. His partner followed, glancing around the room with growing confusion at the assembled group. Their confidence lasted exactly 3 seconds, the time it took them to spot the prosecutor sitting at the table. The change was immediate and remarkable. Officer Wilson actually stopped mid-step, his swagger vanishing like air from a punctured balloon. His partner nearly bumped into him from behind. "Close the door," the commissioner ordered, his voice cold. The officers did as instructed, moving slowly now, eyes darting between the faces in the room. The prosecutor could almost see the calculations happening behind their eyes, trying to figure out what this was about, how bad it was, what story they should tell. "Sir?" Wilson finally managed, addressing the commissioner while pointedly avoiding looking at the prosecutor. "You wanted to see us?" "I did." The commissioner gestured to the 2 empty chairs at the table. "Sit down." They sat, Wilson's back ramrod straight, his partner fidgeting with his uniform sleeve. "Do you recognize this man?" the commissioner asked, nodding toward the prosecutor. Wilson cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. We conducted a routine traffic stop on him last night." "Routine," the commissioner repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "Yes, sir," Wilson continued, gaining confidence. "He failed to signal a lane change. We issued a citation according to procedure." The prosecutor watched silently, noting how quickly the lie came, how practiced it sounded. The commissioner leaned forward. "Before we continue, I want to be very clear about something. This meeting is being recorded. Anything you say can and will be used in any disciplinary or legal proceedings that may follow. Do you understand?" Both officers nodded, looking increasingly uneasy. "Good. Now I'm going to play something for you." The commissioner nodded to the prosecutor. For the second time that morning, the prosecutor pressed play on the recording. This time, he watched the officers' faces instead of the commissioner's. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. The initial confidence, the dawning realization, the moment of panic, and finally, the desperate search for an escape route. By the time the recording reached the part where they had discussed fabricating reasons to arrest him, Officer Wilson's face had turned ashen. His partner was sweating visibly, a drop running down his temple. When the recording ended, the commissioner spoke into the silence. "Would either of you like to revise your statement about last night being a routine traffic stop?" Wilson opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Sir, I can explain." "I sincerely doubt that," the commissioner cut him off. "But please try." "The recording doesn't have context," Wilson stammered. "We had received reports of suspicious activity in that area, and—" "Stop." The commissioner's hand slammed onto the table. Don't compound your mistakes with lies. I've already checked. There were no such reports. The Internal Affairs chief spoke up for the first time. Your body cameras were off during this entire interaction. Department policy requires them to be active during all civilian encounters. Can you explain that? The partner finally spoke, his voice a nervous rush. We had technical difficulties, sir. The equipment malfunctioned. Both cameras? Simultaneously. The Internal Affairs chief's skepticism was palpable. That's quite a coincidence. Wilson suddenly seemed to realize the gravity of their situation. His demeanor changed entirely, professional mask crumbling. Sir, it was a mistake. We've been working double shifts all week. We were tired. Things were said that shouldn't have been. He turned to the prosecutor, desperation in his eyes. We didn't mean anything by it. You understand how it is out there, right? The pressure. The prosecutor regarded him steadily but said nothing. Please. Wilson's voice cracked slightly. I've but 12 years on the force. My partner here has a family. We can't lose our jobs over one mistake. One mistake? The commissioner repeated incredulously. You conducted an illegal search, detained a citizen without cause, fabricated a citation, and made threatening statements. And those are just the violations captured in one traffic stop. He leaned forward. How many other mistakes have there been that weren't recorded? The partner began to cry, quietly at first, then with hitching breaths he couldn't control. Please, sir, my kids, my mortgage. I was just following his lead. Wilson shot him an angry look, then turned back to the commissioner. What can we do to make this right? There must be something. Suspension? Desk duty? Anything. The prosecutor finally spoke, his voice calm in the face of their desperation. This isn't about punishment, it's about accountability. It's about making sure no one else experiences what I did last night, or worse. The officers looked at him with a mixture of fear and pleading that couldn't have been more different from their arrogant attitudes the night before. 3 weeks after that momentous meeting in the commissioner's office, the prosecutor sat in his home, reading the morning newspaper. The headline on the front page told the story: 5 officers suspended in widening misconduct investigation. He took a sip of coffee, reflecting on how quickly things had moved once the recording became public. Within days of that confrontation, both officers had been suspended without pay. The commissioner, facing pressure from community leaders and the media, had appointed a special prosecutor from a neighboring county to handle the case, avoiding any appearance of conflict of interest. But the story hadn't ended there. As investigators dug deeper into the 5th Precinct's activities, they discovered that Officer Wilson and his partner weren't isolated bad apples. Their behavior was part of a pattern that had been ignored or buried for years. Complaint forms that had mysteriously disappeared. Dash camera footage that had been accidentally deleted. Witness statements that had never been followed up on. The prosecutor's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was the community center director from the neighborhood where he'd been stopped. Have you seen the paper? She asked without preamble. I'm reading it now, he replied. The meeting hall is packed. Everyone's talking about it. They're saying you're the one who broke it open. He sighed. It wasn't supposed to be about me. But it is, she said simply. And people want to hear from you. Would you come speak at our community forum tonight? Just a few words about what happened and what happens next. He hesitated. Public speaking was part of his job, but this felt different, more personal, more important somehow. I'll be there, he finally agreed. That evening, he stood before a crowd that filled every seat in the community center's meeting hall. People lined the walls, some holding handmade signs thanking him for his courage. As he approached the podium, the room fell silent. I'm not here as a prosecutor tonight, he began. I'm here as a neighbor who experienced something that too many of you have experienced before. He told his story simply, without legal jargon or dramatic flourishes. He described the fear he felt despite his position and privilege. He explained how the recording had made all the difference, proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. But here's the truth, he continued. What happened to me wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the outcome. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. For years, many of you filed complaints that went nowhere. You followed the proper channels that led to dead ends. You were told there wasn't enough evidence, or that it was your word against an officer's. He paused, looking out at the sea of nodding heads. The difference wasn't that I faced worse treatment than anyone else. The difference was that I had proof and I had access, and that shouldn't be what determines whether justice happens. The next day, he met with the police commissioner again, but this time as part of a newly formed civilian oversight committee. The commissioner looked tired, the recent weeks of scrutiny and reform having taken their visible toll. The special prosecutor is filing criminal charges, the commissioner informed him. Civil rights violations, falsifying reports, misconduct in office. The prosecutor nodded. And the broader changes we discussed. The commissioner pushed a folder across the table. New training protocols focusing on implicit bias. Body cameras that officers can't disable. An independent review board for all civilian complaints. He sighed heavily. It's going to be a difficult transition. Some officers are resisting, saying it undermines their authority. And what do you say to them? I tell them that real authority doesn't come from a badge or a gun. It comes from the community's trust, and we've got a lot of work to do to earn that back. 6 months later, the prosecutor stood in the back of a packed courtroom, watching as Officer Wilson and his partner accepted a plea deal. They would never wear badges again. The judge's words echoed through the quiet room. The greatest betrayal of public trust is when those sworn to uphold the law believe themselves above it. As he left the courthouse, a young officer he didn't recognize approached him. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you." The prosecutor looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For not painting us all with the same brush. The new training program, the community forums, they're making a difference. Younger officers like me, we want to do this job right." The prosecutor smiled for what felt like the first time in months. That's all any of us want. As he walked to his car, he reflected on the unlikely chain of events that had started with one traffic stop. The road to real change was still long, with many obstacles ahead. But for the first time in years, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. He thought of something his mentor had told him when he was just starting his career. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about fixing the systems that allow wrongdoing to flourish. Looking back at the courthouse where those officers had finally faced consequences, he allowed himself to hope that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than one case, one recording, one moment of accountability. Something that might, in time, restore the trust that had been broken for too long.